Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are here with University of Alberta's Andrew Leach. There's been a lot of talk about this correction slash quasi retraction that the Parliamentary Budget Officer made about his carbon pricing report. I figured I would get an actual energy economist to help me walk through what it is that the problems are and why this report was such a dog's breakfast to begin with. Um, I guess I would just start by saying, so it was a distributional analysis of what the carbon price is going to do for households across 5 income quintiles,
Yeah,
which fair enough, and this is the part where the government keeps saying that the 8 out of 10 households get more back than they pay. But then
right.
he also did weird things like added an average into that, which basically undermined the whole point of the distributional analysis. And then added this second part about the part of the broader economy impact. And that's the part that's come into trouble if my understanding is correct.
Yeah, so I mean to start with, all of these are the right questions to ask, right? We want to know the distribution. We probably want to know for the debate purposes the average or typical. We know the median from the quintile analysis anyway. So we want to know all of that stuff.
Okay.
And I think we also want to know, like, we don't want to just assume that there's no macro effect of an individual policy, right? We
Right.
know that, use Quebec daycare as an example. We know that there are direct effects, families pay less for daycare, but we also know that there are really important long-term macroeconomic effects that you would miss if you just said the whole point of this program is people get cheap daycare. You miss the long-term labor force participation, educational attainment, like all of those things that are really important. So I think, and you could go through other programs, the income supports, the measures to address child poverty, right? Those have all kinds of knock-on effects, and you wouldn't want an analysis that just said, what are the straight distributions of this, and think that you had all the answers. I think Aaron Wary had a good piece on this. Like, we want clarity on these policies. So
Mhm.
there are multiple questions to ask. I don't see a problem with the PBO answering multiple ones. The question is, how did they answer it? And if the assumption, and I think Robson Fletcher and Aaron Wary both had nice pieces on this, if all you're doing is effectively assuming that carbon prices decrease economic activity, and not exploring all of the potential channels where this happens, you're essentially writing a report that says carbon policy is bad for Canada, and here's the distributional consequences of that bad policy. And that's an answer, but it's probably not the answer that we need to do what the PBO is supposed to do, which is clarify the debate.
Right. And it seems to me that it was this very binary, this is the price when it goes up, and nothing about like any actual behavioral changes that the policy is supposed to bring about. So it's just here's the price and versus no price at all, which again is also not really a realistic option.
Well, the models will have some behavioral elements to them, right? People respond to prices, and that's a behavioral decision. You might decide, and your behavior might be, I take the bus, or your behavior might be, I line up at Costco whenever gas is a little bit cheaper, and I try to fill up my tank at the last possible minute. So that's built into some of the responses that we have, is that under higher price worlds, people are going to respond differently. But the issue, I think, with this particular report that the PBO has revealed now is that two things. It was a broader application of the carbon price that was being, because there a broader removal of the carbon price. It was
Right.
taking away anything that has a federal price on carbon right now, as opposed to taking away the federal fuel charge. And those reactions, that investment side or industrial side, those have behavioral responses that are a little bit different. There are people deciding, do I relocate my factory somewhere else? Do I install new technology in my factory? Do I build a new oil sands facility or an LNG facility? And so it's, I think, quite probable, and Trevor Toome did a really nice job of this, that it's those effects that were driving the big economic impact results that Mr. Giroux's team came up with. We don't know that because he didn't show us, but that would be my sense is, if you're getting really big macro effects, it has to be something that is, money not coming into the economy or money leaving the economy that's driving that. It's not just going to be people trading off between I'm buying more expensive fuel versus I'm not taking a road trip, as seems to be the discussion this week in the House of Commons. But those things are not going to have the same type of macro effects as the big industrial emitter effects could.
So in his kind of defense of the error that he made, he keeps saying that it shouldn't matter very much because 80% of those emissions are already not being charged under the output-based system. But I don't know that I'm not an economist. I don't know how true that really is, and B, what if it means, or if it's correct in saying that it wouldn't have much of an effect.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is their model did get big effects in provinces. So Alberta, for example, where the federal output-based pricing system doesn't apply.
Right.
It's the Alberta-based system. And so I don't think we know enough yet as to how exactly the error was implemented, right? They've said, well, we modeled both policies, but because they weren't supposed to be really modeling that policy in the first place or changing that policy, there's not a lot of detail in their reports on how they modeled that policy. So I took issue with that a little bit as my indirect critique of the report to say, one of the things that might have been interesting is if they would have done more detail in their report, if they would have said, where are the channels through which these economic impacts are happening? Oh, look, it's because there's a big decline in oil sands production in Alberta. Wait, that doesn't make sense. Why is oil sands production in Alberta declining in response to a change in the consumer carbon price? That's either we're modeling the wrong policy or the responses in our model aren't quite right. And so I think if they'd have been more, gone more into the detail as opposed to just like drop a bunch of tables and numbers and say, here they are, then maybe they would have found their error earlier on. And it would have saved us now what is, I think it's a debate that's going to have some Easter eggs, so to speak, for everybody. It will be, the Liberals will say, well, the impact was not as large, and the PBO report that's been cited for a while, you can't hang it on it. But then the Conservatives, I think, will say this report actually shows that there is an effect from all carbon pricing, and these are all Liberal policies, and is this well, maybe we axe the whole thing. So I think there's no clear winner other than as I think Aaron Wary and put it really well today, today or yesterday, like it's the debate that is now it's just muddied everywhere, right? What we thought was, okay, there's this clear talking point of 80% of Canadians made better off on this fiscal trade. The amount of dollars that you pay in a carbon tax every year will be smaller than your rebate for 80% or 70% or 60% of people. That was a pretty clean thing. PBO report disrupts that and says, well, hold on, there's this macro story. It's probably not, it's not necessarily true. Now we're disrupted again by the PBO. Well, okay, we have this error we need to correct. And I think and then the office gets, I think, skewed a little bit by saying this doesn't affect the overall results. Well, if you know that, show me the new results to show it, right? It's not going to take till the fall to get that out. If it's rerun the model, rework the tables, and done, then that's a 2-week project, or at least a 2-week, temporary amendment they've already had 2 months. So I think that there's some inconsistency in the messaging coming from the PBO. The thing with the Environment Canada report was, I think, a little offside. So there's some things that are happening with the office that are probably not ideal in this debate as well.
Yeah, this Environment Canada report is really kind of taken on a life of its own, particularly going on in question period where, it's It's now kind of turning into a conspiracy, and I'm just wondering if you have any particular insight on what it might have been that he's referring to.
I mean, I'm sure, Environment Canada does publishes modeling results all the time for their scenarios. So they do the biennial reports to the United Nations. They do, for a long time, we had a publication called Canada's Emissions Trends. They publish annual emissions projections under different cases, under different policy assumptions. So there are plenty of Environment Canada reports that show a relationship between GDP and carbon pricing, or GDP under different scenarios for carbon pricing. There are Canada Energy Regulator reports that have kind of the similar storyline that use Environment Canada modeling as a feed-in. So I don't know that there's this like secret report, but I imagine what you had was a series of model runs that were not, polished public reporting, and that was shared with the PBO on their request, and it'd be a normal thing, I think, for the department to say, but these are not fully vetted, they're not wrapped up in a report form, they're not, we don't want you to release these as an appendix to your report. That seems to me to be pretty normal, at least in the way that federal governments do modeling work, right?
Yeah.
Every rough run of a model doesn't go on the government webpage.
Yeah.
But I think it does highlight, I mean, one of the things that would be interesting is how much could we open source some of these models? How much could we have more access to these data and understand a little bit more about what's going on? And some people have done that. The 440 megatons folks have done it. Pembina had a policy slider for a while that you could play around with, and with a simpler model. So that stuff's out there.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things I just wanted to touch on was, I guess one of the criticisms of the PBO just tends to be around this black box of the methodologies he tends to use. And I know you had tweeted some of this particular criticism in regard to this, saying, we don't really know what went into his models, and he won't say. And, I've heard other economists talk about their astonishment at where some of his, he seems to have come up with some of his methodologies. So I'm just wondering if you can just kind of broaden out on why this is a concern.
Yeah, I mean, there's economists that are maybe better positioned than me to comment on the specific methodologies. Ken Fellows at Calgary would be one. Jen Winter, Brett Dolter would do a lot more work with this particular type of model. Trevor Toome with the SPSDM model for the distributional stuff. But the key thing, like you look at that distributional report, and I think I highlighted on Twitter, it's sort of one paragraph of how we modeled this. And, models are just that. They're models. They're statistical buildup of a representation of the Canadian economy and the energy system. They've got simplifying assumptions all the way through, and it'd be helpful to know what those are.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be helpful to know also some of the results that come out of it. Like you used the term earlier, like what are the pathways through which we have this economic downturn? I think in writing those up, sometimes you learn about where the limitations are of your own model. And if you're seeing, policy A affects, all of a sudden we're growing wheat in Newfoundland because we cut the carbon tax, you might think, well, maybe I've got something wrong in my model.
Yeah.
And that iterative approach of showing more stuff can tend to lead to a better modeling outcome overall.
All right. Well, thanks for walking us through this. I feel a little better informed now that, we've been going through this back and forth for a week or so now. So thanks for taking the time to do this, and we'll chat again in the future.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. Thanks for having me.
All right.
See you later.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.